He pushed open the heavy wooden door with the same calloused hand that had once held a radio under crossfire in the desert. The bells at the entrance rang, discreetly, almost timidly, as if they knew that this man had heard sounds far more deafening. James entered the bookstore slowly, his steps dragging, his eyes downcast. It was early fall in Ohio, and the breeze that escaped through the cracks in the door carried the scent of dry leaves and old memories. He wasn't looking for a book or company. He just wanted silence, a refuge, a place where he could hide from the world and from himself. With his shoulders hunched and the posture of someone who has already carried more than he should, he settled himself at one of the tables next to the window. The golden sunlight hit his marked skin, revealing old scars that his uniform had never completely hidden. He ordered a simple coffee, black, bitter, like almost everything in recent years. The cup arrived hot, but he didn't touch it. He let it cool. He watched the movements of the others as if watching a silent film. People talking, smiling, carrying on with a life that seemed to no longer fit him. It was as if the world had moved on, and he had remained frozen in time. James hadn't set foot in that city for 2 decades. Since the day he embarked, young, full of certainties, and unaware that the greatest battlefield would be his return. A lot had changed since then. He lost friends, lost nights, lost pieces of himself that would never be restored. But there was one loss that he never fully digested. Elena. Her name was still a breeze that blew inside him in the sleepless early mornings. He never saw her again. He never heard from her again. He only knew that it was there, in that city, where everything had begun, and perhaps ended. As he absently gazed at the shelf next to him, his eyes fell on a book with a worn cover. It was a collection of war stories. He picked it up in his hands with a certain care, as if holding a sleeping bomb. As he opened it, an old photograph fell to the floor. It wasn't of him. It wasn't of Elena. But for some reason, it made him shiver. He slowly bent down to pick up the image. And that's when it happened. A laugh, clear, sincere, familiar, as if it were reaching through the years and straight into his chest. James froze. This couldn't be real. The mind has a way of playing tricks on you when your heart has been empty for too long. He closed his eyes for a second. He took a deep breath. But she was still there. That laugh. The same one that had once made him fall in love under the bleachers at school, back when they still believed that love could endure anything. He turned around slowly, afraid of what he would find, or of finding nothing. And there she was, sitting at one of the tables in the back, leafing through a book of old poems, with the same distracted manner as always. Her hair, now with a few strands of grey, fell softly over her shoulders. She wore glasses, but her gaze was exactly the same, full of life, even though it was covered by some sadness that he still didn't understand. It was impossible, or was it? His heart, accustomed to the rhythms of combat, lost its rhythm. He was left breathless for a moment. Time seemed to stop. The voices around him disappeared. The walls of the bookstore dissolved. There were only the two of them. A present interrupted by a past that insisted on staying alive. James wanted to get up. He wanted to talk. I wanted to run to her and ask her if she also thought about him on those nights when the world seemed to be falling apart. But his feet wouldn't obey. His hands shook. Fear took hold of him, like he had never felt on the battlefield. Because there were no weapons there, only memories, only open wounds. And then she looked up and saw him. What happened in the next few seconds might change everything he believed to be definitive. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover now might really surprise you. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his eyes locked on hers, as if trying to figure out if it was real, or if loneliness was playing tricks on his mind once again. The sound of his name coming from Elena's mouth was like a muffled gunshot in his chest. He had forgotten what it was like to be called that sweetly. For years, he had been just sergeant, soldier, survivor. He was never just James again. She stood up slowly, as if she was also trying to believe what she was seeing. The table between them seemed like an abyss, and even though neither of them said it out loud, time screamed between the lines. 20 years. 20! It was too long to keep a vivid memory. But there she was, alive, and at the same time, as marked as he was. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Her hands, once steady, now carried a slight hesitation, as if they had held too much weight for too long. Life, somehow, had been hard on both of them. They walked to the sidewalk like old acquaintances who no longer know how to greet each other. James talked about the weather, and she smiled strangely. As if that were all that was left. Time and silence. For a few moments, they walked side by side until the corner. He with his limping step, the result of an explosion that almost took his leg. She with a slight slump in her shoulders, as if she were carrying an invisible world. No one talked about the past. No one dared to mention the name of pain. But their eyes screamed truths that their mouths could not yet bear. When they said goodbye, a soft, almost sweet awkwardness hung in the air, as if they both knew that their meeting was no coincidence, but still didn't know what to do with it. James went back to his small house in the oldest neighborhood in the city, where everything seemed still. The same neighbors, the same faded facades, the same uncomfortable silence of 4 in the afternoon. She sat down in the worn armchair, took off her boots with difficulty, and stood there, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't understand what she was feeling. It was as if her presence had reopened a wound that he thought had already healed. But no, she still hurt. That night, sleep wouldn't come. James turned over and over in bed, sweating, even though it was cold outside. He remembered the night he left. There was no goodbye, no letter, no explanation. He just disappeared. He thought he was doing the right thing, that I needed to go, fight, win. But deep down, it was fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of promising and failing. And now, 2 decades later, that still weighed on him. The image of Elena, with that delicate smile and deep-set eyes, wouldn't leave his head. On the other side of the city, Elena was also not sleeping. She stared out the window of her rented apartment downtown, her arms crossed and her heart restless. The reunion with James had stirred something she had buried for a long time. She had also had her war. She didn't wear a uniform, nor did she carry weapons. But she had lost battles, a failed marriage, a child that never came, abandoned plans, blank pages. And now, that face she knew so well reappeared like an unanswered question. The following days were a coming and going of thoughts and unsent messages. Until, on the 4th day, she went back into the bookstore. And he was there, as if he had never left. They both smiled shyly, and she approached him without saying a word. They sat at the same table as the first time. The waiter brought coffee for both of them. Silence. Until Elena took an old notebook out of her bag. She placed it on the table, opened it to a random page, and pushed it toward him. "Read this," he said, his voice low. It was a poem. One of those that speak of reunions that hurt more than separations. He read it slowly, and when he reached the last line, a tear escaped. She tried to hide it, but her eyes were also filled with tears. There, without needing to explain, they understood that the pain of one was familiar to the other. That time had not erased it had only silenced it, and that perhaps the reunion would not be the end of their longing, but the beginning of something that could still be saved. But what neither of them knew was that there were buried secrets, things that were left unsaid, decisions from the past that left their mark, and a hidden truth that James still hasn't had the courage to reveal. It wasn't just time that separated them, it was what happened during it. And if she knew, would she still look at him the same way? Now it's time to dig deeper, because what's about to be revealed could change everything they thought they knew about that reunion. Write in the comments. There are things that time cannot erase. The next morning came with a grey sky and still air, as if time were hesitant to move on. James waited for her in front of the old movie theater in town, now transformed into a small second-hand furniture store. The faded signs still bore the marks of the old letters, like memories that insist on not disappearing. When Elena arrived, wrapped in a moss-green coat, and with her hair tied up in a messy knot, he noticed that she was carrying a book in her hands. The same leather-bound notebook from the day before. But this time, she didn't open it. She just held it, as if carrying a piece of what was left. They walked without saying much, their steps synchronized, although marked by heavy silences. They passed the iron bridge that had once been the favorite meeting place of their youth. The river flowed beneath them with the same speed as before, but they both seemed trapped in a slowness that only longing could impose. Elena pointed to the old dismantled carousel on the other side of the bank and smiled sadly. "That's where you said you wanted to have 5 children," she murmured. James tried to laugh, but his throat was clogged. "And you said you were going to write stories about all of them," he replied, trying to hide the pain in his light tone. The weight of unfulfilled promises hung in the air. Every corner of the city seemed to remind them of what could have been. The park where they had danced to the sounds of an impromptu band in the summer of 1998 was now just a dry and forgotten plot of land. The bench where they had shared their first kiss was covered in dead leaves. And even the milkshake at the little diner, which had reopened under new management, seemed to have lost its original taste. Sitting at a corner table, the two of them drank in silence. Until James asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you still write?" Elena, staring at the glass, shook her head. "Not since you left." That hit him hard. He had no idea that his absence had erased so much, and as much as he wanted to explain himself, he knew that nothing he said would erase the fact that he had disappeared, that he had not even sent a letter. The fear of no longer being the man she deserved made him run away, but she never knew that. She only saw emptiness. And how could he explain to someone that it was the fear of not coming back in one piece that had kept him from keeping in touch? As they left the diner, a lady recognized them. "Weren't you that couple from school? How lovely to see you together again." The comment was innocent, but cutting. Because they weren't together. They were just two survivors trying to figure out if it was still possible to rebuild something amidst the rubble. Later, on the way back, Elena stopped in front of the town library. The closed building, under renovation, exuded dust and neglect, but she insisted on going inside. One of the employees recognized her and let them take a quick tour. They went up to the second floor, where years ago they used to study together, and there, in front of a dusty bookshelf, she took the notebook from her bag and opened it. "Do you want to know why I stopped writing?" she said, flipping to a marked page. James nodded, breathless. She showed him a poem, written shortly after he had left. It was raw, torn. A rant that spoke of absence, of letters that never arrived, of sleepless nights waiting for news that never came. He read each line as if revisiting a pain buried alive. When he finished, he looked at her, but Elena looked away. "It was my last attempt to understand. After that, I put everything away." He meant that he had written to her too. That there had been nights in torn tents where the only relief was to scribble her name on the side of a military notebook. But none of that came out of his mouth. It stuck, like so many other truths. Because now there was a chasm between what had been lived and what had been silenced. And even though they were both there, in the same physical space, it seemed that they still lacked the courage to cross certain boundaries. As they walked back, a group of teenagers passed them, laughing loudly. One of them looked at James, then at Elena, and blurted out, "She must be with him out of pity." It wasn't said loudly, but loud enough for both of them to hear. Elena stopped, stared at the group, and didn't say a word. She just squeezed James's arm tightly. He didn't react. Inside, though, something snapped. When he got home that night, he didn't turn on the light. He slumped on the couch, still wearing his coat and boots. The young man's comment was eating at him. So many battles fought, so much blood spilled. And now, the shame of appearing weak in front of the only person who still mattered. He pulled an old photo from his pocket. It was from 2003, taken by a squad mate. In the picture, James was smiling. The only real smile he had seen in years. On the back, in shaky handwriting, was written, "I'll come back for you." But he didn't come back. And that truth consumed him. Before going to bed, he grabbed a pen and paper. He wrote something short, simple, and put it in an envelope. The next day, he discreetly left it on the table where Elena used to sit in the bookstore. No one noticed. No one noticed. But he left there feeling that, perhaps, he was taking the first step toward facing what he had always avoided. There was still much to say, many revelations to be made, because what seemed like a casual reunion carried behind it a story yet untold. And some truths, when they are finally told, have the power to change everything. Write in the comments. Some wounds do not heal in silence. The afternoon was falling slowly, painting the old facades of the city with golden hues and long shadows. James and Elena walked together, side by side, their fingers intertwined in an almost automatic gesture, as if their bodies knew the way back before their minds understood it. But there was a weight in his steps that went beyond his injured leg. It was an invisible, dense weight that dripped from his gaze every time someone watched them for too long. On the sidewalk outside the downtown bakery, a woman stared at them without hiding her gaze. He looked her up and down, his face full of judgment. Not the direct kind of judgment, but the cruel kind that comes with silence and a raised eyebrow. James looked away, trying to pretend he didn't understand, but Elena could feel it. Her discomfort was obvious. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw clenched, the sigh caught in her throat. Further on, near the square, a group of teenagers laughed out loud. One of them, pointing discreetly at James, commented in a mocking tone, "An old man like that, hanging out with a woman like that. He must be one of those guys who makes up war stories to seem important." The others laughed out loud, without even imagining the damage those words could cause. Elena stopped. Her smile faded. Her eyes burned inside, but she held it in. It wasn't just outrage. It was pain. Pain at seeing him diminished. Pain at knowing that even survivors carry wounds that never fully heal. She looked at James. He kept walking, as if nothing had happened. But his hand was shaking, and inside, everything was falling apart once more. That night, James didn't want to have dinner. He said he was tired. Elena respected that. But an hour later, alone at home, she sent a short message, without commas, without ceremony. You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore, but you do have to forgive yourself. The answer did not come. He read it, and it froze. James turned off the light in the room and stood there, staring at the reflection of his own face in the window. The message echoed in his head like an echo that was impossible to ignore. Forgive yourself. How? How do you forgive yourself for running away without saying goodbye? How do you forgive yourself for not having written a single line while your companions died beside you, crying for help? He survived, but he didn't always believe he deserved it, and that thought haunted him like a constant nighttime whisper. On impulse, he opened the old shoebox where he kept his papers from the past. Among the medals, IDs, and torn letters was a carefully folded sheet of paper, a letter written to Elena, but never sent. It began, "If you're reading this, it's because I finally got the courage to come back." But the letter ended unfinished, like everything between them. James reread the note, and he cried. Not like someone who sheds a solitary tear in the dark. He cried with his chest heaving, his knees bent on the living room floor, his face buried in his arms. That cry that only those who have been broken understand. The one that cleanses, but also tears. There was no noise, just uneven breathing, and memories parading like ghosts in silence. The next day, Elena was waiting for him at the door of the bookstore. When he arrived, her eyes searched his as if trying to decipher a forgotten language. They didn't ask anything. They didn't charge. They just walked to their usual table and sat down. After a few minutes of silence, she took a tissue from her pocket. "You forgot this last time," she said, handing it to him gently. James looked. It wasn't his. But for some reason, when he opened it, he saw, written in blue pen, "The scars you hide are the bridges that can reconnect us." His eyes widened. "Did you write this?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "It was in one of the books. I think someone forgot it." But he knew this was no coincidence. It was a reminder left by fate, or by something greater, that the past may have been harsh, but the present could still surprise. Still, he had to tell her. He had to tell her what no one else knew. The real reason for his abrupt departure all those years ago, it hadn't just been his enlistment, or an urgent order. There was something more. Something he'd kept buried all these years. Something that, if said out loud, could change everything between them. But how to reveal a truth that could break everything again? James swallowed hard. He looked at Elena. And even with my heart racing, I knew the moment was near. I couldn't carry everything alone anymore. Because silence, no matter how protective it may seem, eventually becomes a prison. There are things that only begin to heal when they are said. Comment here. Not all silence is peace. The rain fell softly, persistently, as if the sky was crying for something that even it couldn't explain. The park was empty, only the sound of drops on the wooden benches, and the wind rustling the leaves. Elena hugged her arms against her body, sitting on the old iron bench where James used to stop in the late afternoons. She carried with her the same coat she had worn the night of dinner, the one in which he had simply gotten up and left, leaving silence in place of explanation. 3 days had passed since then. 3 days without an answer, without a sign, without any trace other than that single message. "I don't want to hurt you again." She reread it more than 20 times. She tried to understand. She tried not to blame herself. She tried to believe that he needed space, but the pain wouldn't subside. The pain of doubt was worse than the certainty of the end, because when we know it's over, it's like closing a door. It hurts, but it's concrete. But doubt? Doubt is a half-open door that groans in the wind. As time passed, her coat began to feel heavy with water. Her hair stuck to her face. Her hands felt cold. But she didn't leave, because something inside her told her there was still something to come. Something James had to face alone before he could share it. And she knew that waiting. She had lived it before, in another context, in another time, when, 20 years ago, he disappeared without saying goodbye. Back then, she waited too. He waited for letters, for connections, for anything, and nothing came. Until that same night, between the drops of the storm, something different happened. Across the park, a silhouette walked slowly. It was him. Soaking wet, without an umbrella, his boots sinking into the mud, and his shoulders hunched as if he were carrying the weight of an entire world on his shoulders. Elena stood in shock. She wanted to run to him, but hesitated. She wanted to shout his name, but her voice wouldn't come. So she just waited. James stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes red and unshaven. He didn't say hello. He didn't apologize. He just held out his hand, revealing a water-stained envelope. She took it carefully. It was sealed. And before she could ask, he said hoarsely, "What's that?" "You need to know why I left back then. Why I disappeared. Why I never wrote." Elena clutched the envelope to her chest, trying to contain the trembling in her hands. "Read it when you're alone. But know this. I've never stopped thinking about you. Not even a day." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the rainy mist like the first time, but now leaving something concrete behind. A truth. Hours later, already at home, with a towel around her shoulders and the cup of tea trembling in her fingers, Elena opened the envelope. Inside were 4 handwritten pages. His writing was still firm, but marked by nicks and erasures. It began, "Elena, there are things I have never been able to say, Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I would spare you. But today I understand that silence only prolonged what hurt us. He said that, days before embarking for the war, he received the news that his father had passed away, and with the loss came the weight of responsibility. His family didn't want him to enlist, but he went anyway, motivated by a mixture of anger, guilt, and escape. During his first mission, he saw his best friend being torn apart by a mine. He carried his pieces in his hands all the way to the camp, and since then, he hasn't slept. He wrote that he had tried to keep in touch with her, but every time he started a letter, he was overcome by a panic that paralyzed him. How could he tell her that she was becoming someone he didn't even recognize? How could he talk about blood, screams, despair? He thought she deserved a whole man, not a sketch of a survivor. And when the war ended, he returned, but not home. He hid in small towns, lived off odd jobs, and attended support groups that only made his guilt worse. Until 2 years before that reunion, he tried to end it all. But something stopped him. A photo of her tucked away in an old Bible that he found by chance in a veteran's shelter. It was there that I realized that my story was not over. But I needed time to rebuild what was left of me. When she finished reading, Elena didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and sat there, hugging the pages as if they were hers. For the first time, the pieces made sense. The absences, the silences, the retreats. But along with empathy came a decision. Something had to be done. She grabbed her coat, tied her hair back up, and walked out the door. She knew exactly where he would be. Because when the truth comes out, something changes. Write it down. I'm also trying to rebuild myself. The dry leaves crunched beneath Elena's hurried feet, while the wind blew against her face as if to test her, to ask if she was still sure. But she didn't hesitate. Her heart pounded, memories pulsing with each step. In her hand, the crumpled note, stained by her fingertips. She had read those words dozens of times, but still, something inside her trembled as if it were the first time. I hid in the war, and after it, but never from you. It was as if each letter tugged at a dormant string in her chest. And now, here she was, running not just to find James, but to rescue lost parts of herself. The woods seemed even quieter than they had been before. The trees, now taller, cast long shadows over the damp ground. The old wooden bench was gone, perhaps washed away by time, perhaps uprooted by someone who never knew there were promises planted there. But the tree was there. The same one. With a thick, wrinkled trunk and a heart-shaped scar carved with a youthful pocket knife. In the middle, the initials were still visible, J+E. A small, almost naive detail, but one that had survived the decades, the wars, and the silence. James stood beside the tree, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze lost in the branches. When he saw her, he didn't smile right away. He just took a deep breath, as if the air he was taking in now had a different weight. Elena stopped a few feet away. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world stopped spinning. No sound, no words. Just the impact of being there. 2 survivors. 2 stories intertwined by wounds and silence. She approached slowly. He took one of his hands out of his pocket and held it out to her. But the gesture was not one of someone apologizing. It was one of someone finally giving himself completely. Elena took it. And when their fingers touched, James pulled her close. The hug was long, firm, and wordless. It was no ordinary reunion. It was the hug of someone who knows that the other person has also struggled, even from afar. Who has also survived the weight, the absence, the undeclared grief. But there was something different about James. Not the pained look from before, nor the fear hidden behind excuses. There was a new calm, even if fragile. A presence. A kind of peace that only comes when the truth has been exposed, when the shame has bled all it could. And he was the one who spoke first. I was broken for so long, Elena. I thought it was the end. But when I saw you again, It was like something inside started beating again. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and gently ran her hand over his face. The wrinkles, the marks, everything there told a story that only she seemed to understand. And I kept waiting for a sign, even when I told myself I was over it. Silence returned, but now it was comforting. The two sat at the base of the tree, as in the old days, leaning their backs against the trunk, and they stayed there for a time that cannot be measured with a clock. Sometimes, healing does not come with words. It comes with presence, with surrender, with the simple fact of staying there. After a while, James took a smaller envelope out of his pocket. It was folded carefully. He handed it to her with some trepidation, but with firmness. Elena opened it slowly and found a plain piece of paper with just one sentence written on it. Life taught me to fight. You taught me to come back. She read it once, then again, and, silently, she rested her head on his shoulder. It was as if that gesture sealed something greater than any speech. But there were still wounds. There were still empty spaces. And even in that moment of reunion, Elena knew that the new beginning would not come as if by magic. There were difficult days ahead. There were adjustments, memories, triggers. But now they were together. For the first time, for real. The most curious thing is that same afternoon, as they walked back along the dirt path, something unexpected happened. A little boy was running through the woods, kicking leaves with his little feet. As he passed them, he stopped, looked at James, and asked, without ceremony, "Are you a soldier?" James smiled awkwardly and replied, "I've already gone." The boy paused, looked at James's chest and said, "But you still look like a hero." It was as if that boy had hit the nail on the head with what no one else could see. And in that moment, James understood. The war may have scarred him, but it had not won. And maybe the greatest act of courage was not surviving the war, but going back, facing the past, and allowing himself to be loved again. Write in the comments. Coming back is also an act of courage. The sun filtered through the dusty windows of the bookstore, drawing golden streaks over the stacked books and the serene faces of two survivors. James and Elena were sitting on the same bench, where everything had sort of started again. There was a mature silence between them, unhurried, without the need to justify oneself. The kind of silence that is only possible when pain has been acknowledged and accepted. The hands clasped over the open book were no longer the symbol of a dormant longing, but the confirmation that life, even after the fall, can flourish in wounded soil. In those months, James was slowly returning to the spaces he had been avoiding for years. The first time he spoke in public, his voice was barely audible. The audience was small, made up of young veterans from different places and wounds. Some had blank looks on their faces. Others had clenched fists, as if they were still on the battlefield, even though they were sitting in a brightly lit room. He stepped onto the small stage with tense shoulders, but his heart beating for a reason that wasn't fear. It was truth. And when he began to speak, something changed. James didn't use rehearsed words. He spoke about what he had experienced. The shame of returning. The fear of being weak. The weight of being alive when so many didn't have the chance. The room fell silent. Each sentence he spoke seemed to touch a hidden chord in everyone there. At the end, there was no thunderous applause. Just an exchange of knowing glances and heads that nodded as if to say, "Me too." It was the first time in a long time that James had left a place feeling lighter than when he had entered. Meanwhile, Elena was finding her own voice again in the pages of a new notebook. She started writing short texts, then small chronicles. Until one day, without warning, a poem came to her. It was about time. Not the time of the clock, but the time of the soul. The time that doesn't run in a straight line, that bends, turns, stops, and sometimes is reborn. She wrote it with no intention of publishing it. But when she showed it to James, he simply said, "Other people need to read this." And she, even though she was unsure, let herself go. A small cafe in the city that used to hold reading nights invited Elena to share her writing. She hesitated. She stuttered through the first few sentences. But when she quoted the line, "The love that survived absences," a woman in the front row began to cry softly. And then Elena knew she had touched something. That her pain, now transformed into words, was a bridge. It was healing. Together, the two began to redesign their routine. Not with close-ups or cinematic statements, just with small but consistent choices. A coffee every Tuesday, walks on Sundays, shared reading at night. Sometimes the past still hurt. There were days when James woke up with his chest tight from dreams he couldn't interpret, and days when Elena felt an irrational fear of being left again. But now they talked. They didn't hide. They didn't run away. And that changed everything. One morning, James received a letter. It was from one of the young men he had heard speak months ago. The young man wrote, "I thought my life was over, but you made me believe that I can still rebuild, that there is purpose even in the scars." James read it over and over, his eyes brimming with tears. And then he put the letter in a wooden box that Elena had given him as a gift, where he kept the small, invisible victories of his new journey. Later that day, they returned to the bookstore. The owner already knew them by name. He always reserved the same corner, near the window. They sat down, as usual. James opened a new copy of poetry, and between the pages, slipped a handwritten note. "If you ever feel lost, look for love among the shelves. That's where I found myself." He left it there, hidden, like someone planting a seed for strangers. And as the sun gilded Elena's hair, and the reflection in the shop window painted the image of them together, aged perhaps, but whole, he knew. Some wars end outside the battlefield. Some scars become maps, and some loves simply stand the test of time because they were made to. On the back cover of the book they shared, there was now a new mark. No longer a dedication from the author, but a note written by her. This is our page, where it all finally begins. Write it down. The most beautiful page is the one I have yet to write. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you also believes that certain stories deserve a new beginning. And if this video touched you in any way, even if silently, please leave a like. This helps this type of content continue to reach those who also need to hear it. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Here, we tell stories that are unhurried, but have soul. Stories that heal, that remind us of what really matters, and that may even rescue forgotten parts of us. And tell me in the comments, "I believe in new beginnings." That way, I'll know that you stayed until the end, walking with me on this journey. By the way, there's a video here that complements everything we experienced today. Click on it and stay with me there. There's more history, more truth, and more encounters waiting for you.